Hey, everybody, and welcome to Information Week's webinar. We're going to be talking about taking DevOps to the next level, a hot topic. But not only that, we have two hot speakers who are joining us too. I'm very excited to introduce them shortly, but I have a few things I wanted to bring up before I introduce our speakers. First of all, this is being sponsored by Accurix. We thank them very much, and of course, brought to you by Information Week. You'll notice on the side of your screen there is a dock of widgets that will help you have a better user experience during this presentation. Two very important things I want to point out about those widgets. One is that you can download the presentation, which will advance automatically. You don't need to do that, but if you want to download the presentation, you can do that. Also, if you want to ask any questions, and I know there's going to be a ton of them because these guys have a lot to talk about, but if you have any questions, just type them into that chat window. Bill Clayman, who I'll introduce in a moment, will be seeing your questions, and he will ask them of himself and John Kinsella, who I'll also introduce shortly. And then finally, what we'd like you to do is just enjoy the experience. There's so much to consume here. If you want to share it with anybody after the event is over, you will get a link to the archive of this webinar, and you can share that with whoever you'd like, or just watch it yourself again if you really want to do that. But with that, let me introduce our speakers. First of all, Bill Clayman is going to be joining us. He is the Senior Vice President of Digital Solutions at Switch. He's been in the industry for more than 15 years. I swear it feels longer, but he's been around for quite a while. He's covered a variety of different topics, from AI to DevOps to data center, cloud, DSIM, you name it. He's a knowledgeable person in all of that stuff, and he's been a frequent contributor to Information Week, so we thank Bill for joining us. Also joining us is going to be John Kinsella. He is the Chief Architect for Accurix. He has been with them for a number of years as well. Accurix is a provider of security and compliance tools for the cloud. John also served as VP of Engineering for Qualys. He's also been around the industry for quite a while and brings a wealth of knowledge about DevOps to this conversation. So I'm really excited to hear from these two. Let me be quiet and turn things over to Bill Clayman, who's going to take things over from here. Bill?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Brian. You know what? I don't know if I've ever had that introduction from you. Hot topic and hot speakers. I guess it's a great way to start my Wednesday, so thank you for that. We've got a really great conversation. I'm excited to bring in John Kinsella here in a little bit because we do have a lot of things to cover. And just like Brian mentioned, I love interactive audience. So if you have any questions, we're really going to be talking about some really interesting concepts here around development, low code, no code, DevOps, some of the things that I've seen out in the industry as well. Please don't be shy. I am going to be looking at your questions live. So if I see something like really, really epic, I might ask you, or I might call it out during the conversation as well. So let's just jump into this conversation. So I had a chance to work in DevOps, and I still get a chance to work with some really advanced tools and development of some of the most advanced services and applications and tools that help our digital economy continue to run. And for years, I've seen IT teams that have been speeding through their software development efforts and reducing human error by merging things like development, operations, and testing teams into a single cross-functional team that works together for the duration of the entire development lifecycle. Now, some things have changed. There's even more pressure on IT to speed up development while still continuing to ensure the quality outcomes and secure software solutions that we use every single day. So here's kind of the big question. We know 2020 was an absolute windfall, right? We saw so much stuff happen in the connected world, and a lot of it revolved around data, services, applications, and how we deliver those applications to the people. So how are companies, especially ones that understand the importance of digital modernization, keeping up with this demand? And with a variety of the next level techniques, such as merging security into DevOps to create things like DevSecOps, taking automation to the next phase, next level with new technologies like AI, leveraging things like low code and no code efforts to reduce cost and really free up people power for more complex development tasks, and improving the monitoring of these compliance and governance systems. What are organizations doing to actually support that? And we're going to talk about that. We're going to be discussing this with John a little bit, and I'll talk about some of the things that I'm seeing in the industry as well. So let's kind of jump into this. That's me, that's John, and that's Brian. You've already met everyone. We've already got a fun conversation here in store where we know that creating an environment that's capable of shifting and adapting to market demands isn't always easy. But DevOps does make it happen. Again, this is a new way of developing services and applications as long as you understand how to innovate using development. The challenge still remains, and this is something that I've seen, I'm sure John can talk about this as well a little bit later, that many in the world of DevOps are still seeing the chaos rather than that continuous innovation. And a fragmented approach to development can lead to some serious issues, something that I've seen as well, including security holes. So how do you ultimately create this functioning DevOps environment? How do you create an architecture that can develop faster and give you a better access to better services and application delivery architecture? So I think that's the way we're going to be taking a look at it. And by the way, I love, there's already a couple of questions coming in. It's good to see everybody as well. Happy Wednesday, and I'm glad people are excited about this webinar. I want to start with the concept of innovation. And if you're sick of this word and you're like, Bill, come on, I see this thing on like all the marketing bulletin boards and all that stuff, please understand that there's a little bit of a different meaning here today, as opposed to potentially what we've seen in the past, right? Modernization is so critical because it's what drives our business today. And digital is the catalyst of continued acceleration and business innovation. There's a really cool quote from Lewis Carroll that I wanted to put up here. Here we must run as fast as we can just to stay in place. And if you wish to go anywhere, you must run twice as fast as that. We see that innovation is now focused more on profitable growth, how you can become more adaptive and scalable, targets of higher levels of customer experience and satisfaction, and a lot of it is governed by data. One big thing we saw over the course of 2020 into this year as well is the concept of innovation is no longer this cool, funky marketing word. It's deep breath. It's about survival, right? And those organizations that were capable of delivering applications and services to their users abroad that innovated, that modernized their ecosystems were capable of surviving a little bit more effectively. There's a really interesting report that I had a chance to write for Informa Research. It was the state of IT ops and SecOps, where we asked respondents, well, tell us, what are you looking at right now, especially when it comes to the status of your business or digital modernization effort? And here's what they came back to us with. 84% said that there's currently ongoing modernization efforts to help their organizations become more agile and become more of a part of this digital ecosystem. Now, I can't see your hands go up, but I mean, are you a part of those 84%? And again, it doesn't have to be this massive undertaking. It could be something small and functional for your company. But here's some of the things that they talked about. Take a look at those number 1 and number 2 objectives that folks are saying: improving overall processes and improving operational efficiencies. Obviously, getting closer to the customer, reducing complexity, better visibility of data. All of those other things that you're seeing on there are really important as well. But process and efficiency go a huge way, a long way to help organizations modernize their initiatives. And that's a really fascinating thing to talk about. Now, when we go back to these companies and say, cool, you're really excited to do this. Now, I'm really excited to go on this journey with you as well, but it's not easy. And some of the things that we learned over the course of 2020 is that this innovation and this concept of contextual innovation, right, where you are sort of reflectively looking at what I need or what an organization needs to become better in the digitally connected economy, it's kind of challenging. So had a chance to talk to some leaders in the space, had a chance to ask them what they see in the state of DevOps. And believe it or not, a lot of times it's pretty chaotic, where there's multiple points of solutions from different vendors. There's sometimes technologies that don't always work together. There's disconnects with the business, which is a serious problem, by the way, where we see developers and technology leaders continue to sort of push forward, but still disconnect with the business. We'll touch on that in just a little bit. We see a lot of complexity and fragmentation. This is real. And I know, again, I can't see, but I am going to be keeping an eye on the Q&A window. And you're welcome to drop a note in there for me. Are your environments complex? Do you have these repeated point-to-point integrations that are just simply difficult to manage, and it's difficult to test all these components? Those manual operations are what kind of gets to me sometimes, because those are some of the issues where we see so many talented people putting out fires instead of planting seeds for the business. And that becomes a little bit of a challenge, especially when you introduce more and more manual process into a complex environment as it is. Finally, we talk about things like security and compliance, where it's difficult to enforce consistent sets of policies, measure compliance against those policies, and obviously more difficult to inject improved security practices into an organization. and into what an organization is trying to build potentially. So this is something that I'm seeing out there. Now, back to my state of IT ops. And if anybody's curious about the report, ping me, find me online. I expect my inbox to be blowing up with new friends and new acquaintances and people who are curious about this. It is an Information Week report. Again, it's the state of IT ops and SecOps, and it does talk about some of these major trends. And it does talk about some of the key challenges facing today's development leaders. Here's what they talked about, right? Too much current complexity in our current systems. Almost half of the people said that. Lack of understanding from business and or IT units, ensuring technologies align with the business. I mean, look at that. That's number 2 and 3. And again, I wish I could see everybody, but I don't know if you're nodding or if you're falling asleep or if you're checking out your Amazon wish list. Come back here. This is really important. But are you disconnected from your business? Are there challenges from development and IT and technology leaders where you just have that disconnect between what an organization is trying to accomplish with its business goals and potentially the capabilities of an IT team? Look at this. I love the conversation that's coming in. I'm seeing you. Thank you for putting that in the chat window. Ray, I hear you constantly putting out fires is a huge problem. Any suggestions would be appreciated. I got you. We'll talk about that as well. But that's a challenge. Constantly putting out those fires instead of, again, planting seeds for the organization is definitely a challenge. And it's a very reactive method to go after things, especially in today's world. So good news, Ray. I see your question on there. I'm gonna mark it as checked here. And by all means, if there's anything else, pop those in there. I'll call it out live, especially if it's a good comment like that. So the framework around application and service development is changing. Now, in my experience in working with some of the foremost leaders in development, I've had a chance to work with almost every single type of application migration, refactoring, redesign project. Heck, I had a chance to work on an AS400 migration project into GCP. If you're curious about how that went, it was amazing. I learned a ton, and it was a really, really fun project. But we adopted different kinds of frameworks. We adopted a new service architecture to actually help facilitate and support that. A lot of it did revolve around automation. So one great way to actually alleviate some of these challenges and what organizations are doing is to adopt automation. And as cool as that is, and as much as you're hearing about it, remarkably, in the report that we saw, less than half are still doing this. About 40% of organizations are using automation technologies today in the context of development to help support their architecture. Now, those 60% that aren't doing it yet, well, the vast majority, 75%, they are going to be considering automation in the near future. All right. That's a very high-level word. What the heck does that mean, right? It could be things like automated regression testing, automated validation of code, doing things like DevSec test ops, and doing things like testing validation against your environment, making sure that you have security regressive testing, making sure that you have code validation, check-in, check-out processes that are improved, that are all automated. And all of that is actually funneled into a CI/CD continuous integration, continuous innovation, and continuous development process. So automation is a big part of what companies are doing to help their development architecture become better, and also actually helps remove some of those manual operations. And not saying it's going to put out all the fires, Ray, but it's certainly going to help potentially put out a few of them. And to that extent, the big conversation that we've been having and experiencing is how companies are beginning to look at new coding and development platforms to make their applications even better. Now, I wish I could ask everybody here, raise your hand. Even though I can't see, you don't have to raise your hand. How many folks have heard about things like low code or no code, or this new approach to this kind of architecture? Now, we asked this question in the report. We found about 14% have heard of low code. And of those who know what it is, they're using it to help simplify their DevOps architecture. It's a new type of development platform that simplifies DevOps, drag and drop components alongside model-driven logistics, making low-code development environments powerful solutions, leverages graphical interfaces to simplify development, and there's a whole lot of really fun other solutions out there. Now, for those that do know about low-code and are seeing and actually using it, 82% find that there's value behind it. So let me kind of pause there for just a second. For those that aren't familiar, low-code platforms are application development platforms that allow you to build apps faster with minimum coding. Now, these low-code platforms have been in existence actually for some time, but the development and the usage of them has grown over the past, I would say, 3 or 4 years or so. They initially sprang up as basically just auto code generation tools, but have evolved since into enterprise-grade application development platforms covering the entire application delivery suite. Now, modern low-code platforms speed up the entire development process from requirements to literally going live. And there's some really critical areas where application delivery cycle get optimized in low-code platforms. I'm going to give you just a few examples. Coding is replaced with visual app building, where developers build the end user experience right from the using simple drag and drop and UI components. All services like database, SOAP, REST APIs, CRM security, other external services are integrated into the application architecture visually using simple, intuitive visual interfaces. All of the artifacts of a project that you're working on, front end and back end code, config files, executables, are all automatically generated based on standard best practices. This also, like I said earlier, with things like automation, helps remove some of those human errors during coding because you have a more of a visual process. Continuous development is also a big part of it. In integration, the process of integration, like CI/CD, is simplified because the app is moved through various release phases, like development, QA, staging, production, through one-click development. So literally from the start to finish, it's all one-click deployment where you're using this low-code architecture to visually understand how your application is going to look from the start to the end user. And obviously, future maintenance and scalability of the deployed app is also automatic through horizontal scalability, where modern lightweight containers with the required application are provisioned in a matter of seconds. And by the way, I see, Salesforce is a great example of no code, right? Where it's much more visual and you're able to actually utilize it and create architectures, unique architectures specifically for what you're doing. Great example, Dan. Thanks for paying attention. But there's a lot of benefit here. So remarkably, and I'm glad that some folks on this webinar are saying, yes, I've heard of it. But these technologies actually solve a really big problem out there, right? And just like Ray mentioned earlier, some of these fires that we have to put out are often a disconnect between the business, IT teams, and development, which is a big reason, as kind of a part of this development environment, we have to make sure that IT, the infrastructure that we put forward, the requirements behind IT for our developed applications and services are all aligned, which is a part of the reason why you're going to start hearing about something known as infrastructure as code, right? Our way of actually visualizing where infrastructure plays into the entire development lifecycle. So with constantly evolving and changing markets, business agility is one of the capabilities that needs to be adopted by firms to be able to respond to these new changes and ideas faster. And software development practices have changed a lot recently, making development teams capable of adopting these changes. And where infrastructure as a code actually plays a big role is that it allows businesses to understand and dictate more clearly their goals to development teams and operation teams, and then actually make the process a lot more effective. If you take a look sort of at a high level, how infrastructure has evolved and evolves in general, right? Looking at it from left to right, let's say, there's always this old way, right? The IT still uses old manual configurations, custom scripts, golden images, sometimes outdated tools to manage infrastructure, leading to slower deployments and way too many errors. And I've seen this, right? DevOps person goes to IT, says, hey, I need this kind of architecture. And maybe they'll spin up like a golden image from, and I've seen this from like 3 years ago or for like 2 years ago. They'll throw in a couple updates on it, and it doesn't potentially have what the what the developer needs, or it's going to be prone with errors because there's potentially a problem with infrastructure in terms of how it's actually delivered. So you see, again, those manual deployments, potentially out-of-date release notes, development cycles, errors. So you've got this solution, right? The DTAP, right? Development, test, acceptance, and production. So that's where you start to see the infrastructure as a code evolve a little bit, right? Where you start to see the automation processes make life a little bit easier when you start to be able to visualize infrastructure as a code. And what happens there, especially when you use the tools to help you develop this, you're able to consistently repeat configurations. You're able to test and verify against more modern infrastructure components. You're able to share and promote across the entire environment, and you're able to provide building blocks for continuous delivery pipeline. There's a key point in there. Development of applications and services is a shared responsibility between business, IT, and developers. The Venn diagram, this overlap, right, that you see between these developers and IT and business people is getting much tighter, where these groups are directly integrated together, where you need to be developing an architecture that gives you configuration management, this continuous integration architecture, version controls into a node-based environment the user can then integrate with and actually utilize. So there's a really interesting approach here where we're starting to sort of visualize code potentially in an entirely, potentially different kind of way. And that's what makes it a little bit more interesting. Now, there's certain components within infrastructure as a code that you need to understand that help make life fundamentally easier. So being able to create authorized configurations, manage nodes, roles, and data, manage cloud resources, push configurations, and then from a server perspective, monitor, manage, and do things like history and reporting and compliance testing, contact server and pool configurations, as well as being able to compile and run directly at the node level. So this is where you're, again, being able to visualize and sort of understand what infrastructure as a code looks like throughout the development lifecycle. Take a deep breath here. This is a lot of information. If you got your coffee in front of your water, this is your water break. Oh, much better. So let's put it together really quick. I'm actually really excited. We're going to be bringing in John here in just a little bit to continue this conversation, but let's put it together. Based on my experience, I want to show you what it looks like when you actually have an environment that sort of blueprints all of this stuff together with dev, test, SecOps, key components, infrastructure as a code, and sort of this continuous development pipeline. So this is something that I've seen work. I'm sorry if it's a little bit blurry. Remember, you are going to be able to download this deck and see it a little bit later as needed. Now, if you take a look at the screen with me, right, there's multiple layers. The first layer is the infrastructure layer, then you got the broker layer, code, self-service layer, robotic process automation orchestration layer, and then you got a continuous development pipeline. So this is a blueprint that goes end-to-end application and infrastructure asset automation and helps IT shift from traditional IT operations to things like low code, no ops, low code, different kinds of architectures and delivery models where labor intensive tasks are automated, right? Again, trying to lessen those fires that you might be experiencing. And teams have more capacity for value delivery and certainly innovation. So there's a few key concepts here to understand. So at the infrastructure broker layer, this gives you an ability to programmatically approach and unify the management of different types of systems and infrastructure like virtual private clouds that are built on type of like Hyper-V, VMware, OpenStack solutions, as well as the major cloud providers like AWS, GCP, or Azure. From there, you've got the second layer, which is the infrastructure as a code, and the self-service layer. Again, a lot of automation that gives you the ability to build infrastructure, agnostic solutions, and stacks where all configuration aspects are actually versioned and controlled programmatically. Once such capabilities exist within the environment, they can be exposed via self-service to mitigate dependency from infrastructure teams, which is really great because that means the developer can go out there and continue to do what they need to do, knowing that they can broker a piece in the environment with a self-service layer that they need to continue to be successful. The third part is the robotic process automation and the orchestration layer, RPA, to help with some back office and back end processes. It gives the ability to automate complex workflows and orchestrate their fulfillment across different infrastructure items. It strongly relies on the service desk automation capability. So being able to actually automate some of these functions and scale them out throughout the entire layer. And finally, you've got the continuous delivery pipeline built on top of the described above components. It gives you the ability to promote different software artifacts across the entire environment chain with repeatable quality and build on performance and security throughout an entire verification process. So this is something that I've had a chance to work on and seeing how this works within modern environments. And it's actually pretty inspiring because once you actually have this in place, you're actually going to have happier IT teams, happier infrastructure teams, happier business people, and happier development teams, because even though they still interact quite a bit together, there's more automation, there's more self-service, and they can request more specifically the items that they need. Now, this isn't just a, just a completely, off the cuff, free for all. Obviously, there's controls as far as what you can provision. But again, it's something to certainly think about. Now, there's a question that came in, that are coming in. which I absolutely love. And we're going to talk about things like, infrastructure as a code and RPA here in just a bit. But again, I love these questions. Keep them coming, and we'll sort of dive into it a little bit. Now, I'm going to take a deep breath, and I'm actually really excited to bring in John Kinsella, because we're actually going to be diving into some of these real-world use cases, some of these real architectures around innovation and how we're seeing the change in application and service design. There's John. Welcome to the conversation.
Hey, great to be here. It's no, I have to. I've been having a great time watching you for the last 20, 25 minutes. Now I've got to try and keep up to you, so I'm going to give it my best.
You know what? We were on the pre-call just a little while ago, and we had like an enormously great conversation. You were like, Bill, stop talking and save this for the webinar. I'm like, okay, John, I got you. So we're gonna just jump right into this. We saw a couple of folks on the chat already say that, hey, we are exploring low code or no code, but there's going to be a lot of folks, especially from that report that I saw, that this is still kind of new to them and maybe a little bit scary. So let me take a deep breath here, John. I want to ask you this question up front. In your experience and what you do in the industry, what is low code? How can you describe it to the folks listening? And most of all, where does that value come in?
So we talked about a few different areas around this, but I'll start purely just by looking at low code itself. I think that the most recent example I gave in our pre-show here was if you think about HTML editor. Back when women were coming up to me in a bar and saying, "Hey, you look like a web developer," that was actually a pickup line I got once. But back in those days when I used to get things like that, long hair might have been the hint back then. But the Dreamweaver is low code in a way, right? If that's allowing you to not have to tinker with HTML and CSS and those lower level things, that's what allows you to not have to do the coding and still get picked up in the bar. But I think more recently, we heard someone mention Salesforce. I'll come back to them a little bit later when we talk about ISC. A lot of these tools, particularly, I think really what's great about low code. And it's starting to become more popular in some of the startup magazines or blogs and things like that, is it allows more folks outside of just purely the engineers and the software developers to be able to contribute to the company. If you think of some of these things, it could be something like automating a system. It could be something like running a QA test. In some companies I've worked for, I've been really blessed where the QA teams are able to write code almost as good as the developers. And probably in some cases better, let's be honest. But that allows them to create the automations themselves. In a lot of other places, maybe it's more junior QA team or how they've been hired, and maybe it's more a visual QA versus or QAing UI versus QAing something on the back end. So how you're actually going to go about that might be more useful for a low code type tool. There's all sorts of really different use cases for this. We can talk about the CEO creating reports by doing some pointy clicky stuff. It covers a lot of different areas. I think where we're interested in today is really thinking about how it works with infrastructure and how that makes our lives easier.
You brought up such a good point. I felt like slightly triggered when you said Dreamweaver. I'm like, oh my gosh. I'm a millennial. I may be on the towards the end of the spectrum of that one, but I remember when I started development and coding. Anybody else listening, do some coding in Notepad, because I legit had like Notepad out, would do my coding on there, all the HTML stuff, and then Dreamweaver came by. My world was blown. Like, oh my God, it's visual. I can do this stuff way easier. I don't need Notepad, even though I was still a little bit sad. So you brought up a really good point. I kind of want to dive into this a little bit as far as like sort of the consumption of code and most of all security. This is a big question that I get a lot of times, especially when it comes to low code and no code. And it's kind of a fear, I think, in some of the industries, right? Because I can't see it. What do I do with it? Mm-hmm. So I'm going to ask you this question straight up. With some organizations, some people may be being a little bit concerned about losing visibility into code. And I bet we're going to get a question about this a little bit later. How do these types of development models help security? And most of all, and you're the one that talked about this, the consumption of security in a low code or no code environment. Tell me more about this.
Yeah. So I think there's a growing trend, over the last few months, we've heard about supply chain attacks and all these different types of things. But even over the last few years, there has to be some level of trust, right? So how do you, it's one thing for the guy in the corner office to be creating your, at least reports or maybe some of your websites, what have you, or guy or girl. But as that becomes more intrinsic with the application and more actually not so much a high level, something that looks pretty or on a marketing site, but actually this is driving. We had someone, well, you mentioned RPA in one of your slides. You're now becoming this is very critical. It's very important, right? Anytime we talk about usually cloud providers and cloud services and infrastructure as a service, we start hearing the governmental phrase, critical infrastructure starts getting thrown around. So are you going to have that same level of trust for critical infrastructure being developed through low code as you would be a quarter end sales report? Depending on who you ask, there could be a different question there. But I think this starts coming into how do you consume both that low code? How do you ensure that it is secure, that it's following best practices, that it's doing a lot of these things? I think there's a bit of a, there can be a disjoint between those two. Do we actually trust? Do we believe in what that code's doing? The phrase I think earlier I was saying to you is trust and appreciation of quality of code don't necessarily go hand in hand. And that's sort of this thing, right? It's, a core concept we have in security is trust but verify. So how the question then we come back to is how do we do that in a low code environment?
That's a really, really good point. With new models like zero trust, especially, right, where we verify everything that's connecting to our ecosystem, right? We're starting to adopt some of these broader security models, especially into this. John, I know that things like automation specifically can help alleviate security concerns. And we were getting a couple of these questions here as well. I can tell you that a lot of these automation mechanisms have changed. They really have changed over the years, especially when it comes to development, right? Yeah, I know we can automate processes and I know we can write scripts and stuff. But it's really, really different, right? Everything from like RPA, for example, leveraging infrastructure as a code to automate the deployment of critical IT infrastructure for development. All of that stuff is really different. So I want to talk about a little bit here, how has automation changed in new development architectures? And really from your perspective as somebody who works with this, more of a newer development architecture, what's new and what are you seeing out there as far as automation is concerned?
Yeah, I think the phrase we haven't thrown around here wildly yet is cloud native, right? So a lot of my day in, day out life nowadays is really focused around cloud native. And what I mean by that is an application being cloud native, it has been developed for the cloud and not just to be on a website on EC2 or something like that, but how you develop that application is going to be different. So I think when I first gave a talk around this, of course, my cane, probably about 10 years ago, then it was how do you re-architect your application for the cloud? Was the title for people who are bored. But really the idea around that is, you're now developing something that database connection might go away. You might have to scale up suddenly if you're on the front page of the New York Times. You still have to worry about security, but security has gone from being your perimeter to now being around each individual thing, whether that is a virtual machine or a container or a serverless function or, what have you. You can't do that manually, right? If you're interacting with systems that have, any of us who think for a few seconds about the automation levels, which go on behind an Amazon or an Azure or an OCI, they're crazy balls, right? So for you to be able to think that you're going to survive by pointing and clicking through a UI, that's a nice way to start, but that's not going to get you there. So the question then comes back to how do you both use something that's low code like to get you into an environment like that? And then how do you trust the security of it? And then how do you automate that overall process? So that's really what I've been focusing on and what we think about at Accurix. And, to look at this, we're not going to walk through this whole thing in detail, but this is sort of a glance of the platform and how we do this. So to take a step back and think about ISC and why, I sort of almost offhandedly threw that out there as low code. And I think a lot of people would probably fight back. I'm surprised I'm not seeing screaming into questions yet. But what I mean by that is, okay, think through if you go into an Amazon. I'll use them for an example right now. I'll try and be fair with our vendors. But if you think about what it takes to bring up, say, I want three servers behind a load balancer, you're going to be doing a pretty good amount of clicking. And then if you go to do this again, even though that looks like a low-code environment, it's going to take you more clicking. You're probably going to make a mistake. That's sort of a human quality, right? So this is why we want to start looking at this from, can I define that infrastructure in code? But the code that we're writing to do this is, I mean, I think you could call it a 4GL. If you look at the, the Terraforms or the Helms or the customizes or Puppets or Chefs or Ansibles, or, we were talking in pre-call, I was first doing this type of thing back in the 90s with M4 on Unix systems. It's a templating language for configuring. This isn't new, right? It's sort of like people will start saying to us, containers aren't new. Containers aren't new. Let's make sure I'm clear there. Dude, it's the same thing with IAC. This has been around for a while. But still it's new and it's different and it's improved. It's easier to use. It is closer to no code. How do I use that to automate? So walking through the slide really quickly, what we've come up with is a concept that we want to be part of that process of from when that IAC is being defined. So say you want to create a EC2 instance with a to be able to access it over SSH, and you go and put a web server on there and that type of thing. How do I know that that IAC is meeting best practices? Is it secure? Have I done something, I'll say quickly, and just open SSH up to the world? Is there a firewall group in there that's been misconfigured? What's going on? So there's, it gets more and more deep. And I think if you want to try and do that from a low code point of view, this comes back to what you're asking me before about trust. How do you do trust versus quality in IAC? I think really the answer, whether it's, Accurix or, our open source tool, Terrascan, or pick what you want out there in the market, you have to have some type of linting, some type of static analysis of what you're doing to be able to say, is what I'm doing actually going to get me shot in the foot, or am I actually doing something that's going to be beneficial? So, we do that in development. We go through into a CI/CD process for build and deploy. I was quite shocked you said only 40% of people are automating their development build processes. That's we need that to improve, because this, again, even if you're not doing IAC, guys, no matter how you're doing this, if you don't have some sort of automation process on there that every time a developer is just checking in code, they have, you've given them a task, they have completed it, they've checked it in. Okay, what are you going to do? Are you going to wait till Friday or next quarter when you go to do a release and then you go build and test it then? You're in for a world of hurt if you're not doing this in a more automated fashion. And for the business folks out there, that 40% that's doing it, they're probably your competitors. So time to get cracking on that. But what we're doing in this type of environment is when that IAC code is checked in, say you've got that 3 web servers and we decided we're going to move to containers. Pretty big change. How do you know do you have the expertise in that area? Are you able to make sure that new code is going to be still, meeting standards, both of your company as well as industry? How do you go through that? So this is really the type of tools we've built. And then additionally, we're able to go to the next step of that. I think we've got another slide coming up here in a few minutes to really visualize it. But if I've got a developer who's doing IAC and he's checking that code and it looks clean and cool, and then, you've got operations guys somewhere else who is, it's 3 o'clock in the morning, the server went down, I need a new server, I got to spin something up, I'm going to point and click through it because I don't have access to his stuff or I don't know IAC or whatever have you. All of a sudden you've got this lack of balance, this imbalance between what was written and what's there. So that's considered drift, right? How do you detect that? How do you correct it? How do you remediate it? So these are the type of things which we've created tooling to be able to do for our customers.
And I'm looking at the slide, John. So there's a lot of as code obviously on it. So you're telling me that I'm a developer, right? So, and I use this system and you're basically telling me that you do policy, security, even those roadmap, and drift and remediation as code, as an automated process.
Yeah.
Oh, that's pretty cool. I think what we talked about earlier, were 40% of people not using automation, 60% not. The follow-up question to that question, that research point was, are you planning on doing it? And of those 60%, 3 out of 4 are going to be working with automation in the near future. So I'm assuming that the folks on this webinar who may or may not be using the full complements of automation, or potentially going to be doing that in the near future, I like the slide. I feel like we could just stay on here and talk about all of this. I mean, I'm just so curious about being able to detect whether policy or drift is happening and how you can remediate, or at least point to remediation, and how you can improve it. Go ahead.
Yeah, let me talk to it really briefly, because I gave, again, a very offhanded answer and said yes. And yes, we have, as far as I'm concerned, in the security space, one of the best visual and graphic designers. I've seen him do stuff like this at a previous company. He is amazingly good at sort of figuring out how to draw the stuff out and make it understandable. So, Bo, thank you as always. So let's talk about automation for a tiny second. From the point of view of what does a modern CI/CD workflow look like? And by that, I mean, you're using something like, well, let's see what we have. We have Jenkins and Circle CI on this diagram. Could be GitHub Actions, could be, GitLab. Everyone's got some sort of poison, but some sort of way that automatically goes through. When you check in code, the hamster starts spinning, they do your unit test or some amount of testing or something, and then either if you have really trust and faith and maturity, it'll go ahead and deploy that stuff into production for you. But that's that overall cycle. People are probably familiar with the concept of a pull request. So usually what that means, again, in modern development, someone working in, or a development group working in Git, you don't just have everyone committing code into your master or your main branch. People will make suggestions of, these are the code I want to change. And then, one or two, hopefully, of your coworkers will review that, say that, yeah, that's cool, give you a thumbs up, and then at that point it gets merged in. This is the way Accurix has been designed. So to bring back to our as code things that we talked about, we've talked about IAC. So from a policy as code point of view, what we do is all our policies are actually defined as code and then can be applied against that IAC in that programmatic fashion. But then the next two, the drift as code and remediation as code, is where things get interesting. So if we see that drift I talked about, where a developer has gone through and changed a port, and maybe he had Git access, so he went through and he changed it in code in that IAC. But now we've seen, our system went through and ran and said, hey, something's changed here. This is a drift. Would you like us to fix it? So this is, I'd love to claim fame, but we're the only people doing this. There's a few companies in different areas have been doing this for the last few years, automated pull requests. So what that means, back to our to our low code concept, instead of a developer or an operations person having to go back through and say, well, shoot, I see there's a mistake there because, I've always talked about the security now what problem. You get a 100-page report. What do I do with that? But if the system's now able to say, hey, I see a mistake, here's my recommendation on how to fix it. Here's a pull request for it. Again, in GitHub or GitLab. Once you say that looks good, let's go ahead and merge it. That thing's been fixed, right? So this is the type of thing we want to see. So that's sort of combining both drift as code and remediation as code. And that's where these things get really powerful to me. So while I might have some of my core crack guys writing that IAC initially, I don't have to have them awake and online on the computers 24 hours a day. I'm able to say, maybe something new comes in. We will release a new policy, say, for what came out last week, those Kubernetes vulnerability. So we'll have a policy for that. As we go through and do an automated scan of your cluster on an ongoing basis, we see what we used to think was okay, fine configuration. Now with this new vulnerability, we go, hey, you need to modify this. And we're able to go ahead and set up that process so people can then, without having to go back to their security guy or go back to their Kubernetes guy, or, you mentioned OpenShift, I'm a cloud stack guy, going back to any of those particular guys and figure out what do I need to do here. It's just a few clicks and we're back to the races and we have faith in our systems.
So you mentioned modern development, which it's funny because people will be like, well, what the heck is it anyway? So I'm curious, we're going to shift this conversation very linearly, right? The focus on code is important, but, right, we've seen a lot of stuff change for developers. I work in IT, and I've had a chance to work with cloud and virtualization and really cool infrastructure. And you and I know that, if you and I blink, well, we miss like 10 years, right? This industry is just absolutely so fast. What's changed for developers and leaders alike, especially when we start to take a look at these new kinds of development architectures? There's going to have to be some letting go potentially of this sheer unadulterated focus on just code to better understand how these new systems can impact everything from automation, security to obviously development. So what's changed for developers and certainly leaders, and how does this stuff help them?
There's a lot so when I refer to modern development, I'm really talking about, it's not so much the language. I mean, you could be doing this in Fortran. If some of our listeners aren't aware, Fortran's making a comeback in the machine learning space. So it's gained, I think, 2 positions in the last year in like the top 20. So I think it's up to 18 now or something. But so the language itself isn't the thing. As we start thinking about how do we use that language, what does our development process look like? Are you using Agile or Scrum? It doesn't have to be pure, right? Are you picking parts of some of those development methodologies? Are you using a CI/CD process like we've talked about here? Are you doing some sort of it's not waterfall. It's not something we looked at years ago. You're not doing, as I said, quarterly releases. My wife used to work at a company that did quarterly releases, and I'm like, whoosh, blew my mind. But so that's sort of the basis behind it. If you look at some of the large conferences we got going on now, with DockerCon's coming up, we've got KubeCon this week. There's a lot of these type of systems. Well, last week we had Atlassian I don't know if they call it Atlassian Con, whatever it is, but these are sort of where developers are focused. These are what developers want to be doing, right? They want to be learning. We know developers won't be learning. They'll always be trying the latest, greatest things. So we have to sort of balance what they do and don't do. And that sort of brings you to a diagram like this, where we've talked about most of the stuff on here. I foreshadowed this a little bit with that crazy ops guy. I like the red sweater over on the right-hand side. Red's always bad in security. But so this is this type of thing. This is that grouping that we have to deal with. And these are really 3 different separate personas. And what we're trying to do, not just in modern development, but really think about a concept like DevSecOps or SecDevOps, if people want to call that, or even just say DevOps, where that developer is the one who has control over what that infrastructure is being deployed. So the developer said, and to talk really briefly about containers, developers got excited by containers because, I don't want to shock you with more trigger words, but think about back to our Java EE days, right? If I had the wrong version of Tomcat running on my server and the developer was writing for, Java 5 and we had Java 4 on there, or pick your poison, nothing worked, and it was like it would take days to upgrade. And right, we've all been through that, or some of us have, unfortunately, and we're trying to survive now. In a container world, the developer is developing against that container. He knows what's in it. He knows what versions. He knows what he wants to do. He upgrades when he wants to. He checks in that Docker file and that IAC and all these things. And when he says go, that CI system go ahead and deploys 15 of those containers into production. But maybe not automatically. Maybe he's going to do a red-green deployment. So we're going to launch out 2 or 3, see if they're stable, see if there's any errors. And then as that looks like it's working, now we're going to go over to a new version of software without having to have any sort of teeth chewing on the fingernails. So the operations person, now their role becomes a little different. The security person, their role becomes a little different. But again, we have all these people now playing in the same sandbox, right? So while they all had their sort of separate positions, I'm really fond of the idea of these people working together. I'm really fond of the idea. We had someone recently on a podcast I co-host, Application Security Weekly, talking about embedding the security people into the development team. Get them in there for a few weeks, get them to see what that experience is like, learn what it's like on the other side of the fence. It's a really great thing. But even if we're in the same group, even if we're sitting beside each other at desks, we might do 2 different things in this environment. And that's sort of the problem I was just talking about with the ops guy changes something at 3 o'clock in the morning because the devs aren't around. And then bringing this back to, as you were asking about the management, what visibility do they have on this? What is the state? They're definitely not going to be looking at ISC. They probably don't want to be looking at your Google console. How do we provide them some level of visibility into what's going on in here in a way that makes sense to them, is speaking in a more friendly both tone as well as concepts which they are familiar with? So that's sort of the type of things we're trying to wrap our head around and provide to our customers.
There's so much there to take in, and everybody listening, I want to make sure people aren't scared off by this, because you are talking about a little bit of a shift. Let's call it a shift in how we look at code and development, automation, and how operations development teams need to sit in with security. My goodness, I couldn't agree with you more. And the statement that you said, playing in the same sandbox, is really, really important, because I understand we can be in different sandboxes, and we got all those fun toys in our sandbox, and we can throw it over, the playground. But it's great when we're sort of in that same space. And yeah, there's going to be a little bit of a change, but it's not bad. In working with previous organizations where I had a just complete swim in the world of DevOps, DevSec, test ops, I mean, really some of the most advanced development solutions that you can imagine, one of the big benefits that we saw is the modernization of IT and development teams where they were more of the process, where they did speak with the business more often, where they were more involved. It's funny, you mentioned something that languages are going to be here forever. They're not really going anywhere. And I absolutely agree with you there. And what's really fascinating there is I was just reading the statistic and another podcast I was talking about how there were 2 billion lines of RPG code written last year. RPG. We're talking like Cabal and like AS400. Are you surprised? I mean, AS400 is not going anywhere. I think it still works. At the apocalypse, it's going to be cockroaches and an IBM AS400 server that survive.
You can have me talk. We can come back for another hour and just talk about the awesomeness of iSeries and Z-Series systems. It's amazing what they've done. But yeah, this isn't something. Definitely, we're not trying to scare people here. And remember, I told you about halfway through this conversation, we'd be geared up and we want to go for another hour. So here we are. And I know we're more than halfway. But yeah, there's ways to tiptoe into all these type of things. Part of the reason the developers really love them is because they're really easy to get into. So while it might look fairly complex from the way we're talking about it, that there's pretty easy on-ramps into these systems.
So I want to go back to your slide that literally I think 90% of it was you're writing drift as a code, policy as a code, this as a code revolution, right? Let's call it that. Infrastructure, policy, drift, remediation, security, it's a lot. And I'd like everyone here to just for a second, contextually apply this to what you do every single day and where there's parts and pieces that you can adopt and that can actually improve your process. I want to ask you about this, John, this as code revolution. Why should we not be afraid? What is it? I mean, this is a lot of stuff in here. Infrastructure, policy, drift, remediation, security means a lot of automation that you can simplify. What is it? Is this going to proliferate more? Give me some more details.
So what's really another way to think about this, because I'm going to bring it back to low code again. And the reason I do is it's not scary. And I think this is a good way to think about it is imagine back in our days where, man, some of my friends still build servers. I've got this cloud thing, man. I don't need stuff in my garage, but pick your poison, whatever it is. For those of us who have built a server from the ground, right? Buying the case, getting the motherboard, getting your drives, getting your memory, getting your video cards, your network cards, your cooling systems, your switches, your firewalls, your IDS, your IPS, your WAF, your internet connection. Or I can go into into Terraform, load my AWS module, and say, I want an EC2 instance with, an M4 large, add this disk to it, and give it this public IP address and put the security group on it. Have a nice day. So while this stuff might sound complex and it might sound really heavy and really deep, we're really standing on the shoulders of giants. The stuff we're able to do today on my phone or, hell, on the dumb watch, just amazeballs. Again, it's my phrase of the day. So yeah, well, we're looking at stuff here, policy drift remediation as code. They sound very, very heady, sound very complex. I'm not asking people to learn new languages. On the infrastructure part, maybe, but really on those other parts, you're trusting a third party that as, a bunch of people like me who are experts in these areas to come up with concepts of how do we automate the remediation of that issue, to use that phrase. Here we're looking at what infrastructure looks like. I just talked through a bunch of these sort of points off the top of my head, but looking at the graph, I think I passed. All these components which are in there and they're moving, constantly moving. Identity alone is, I'll be honest, it's not one of my favorite areas to talk about, but how many identity issues have we had in the last few months? Active Directory issues, IAC exposures, credential exposures. Yeah, so all these type of things, right? That alone, without worrying about the rest of it, if you have some way of doing detection or remediation on that alone by itself, that's a pretty great way to end your week, I think. But all these things going through and thinking about them, that's really where I think a company like Accurix comes into form. And I'll be honest, when one of the co-founders was first talking to me about Accurix a few years ago and it was a star in their eyes, I'm like, dude, why would I care about this? I can just go and rerun Terraform apply, and it's just going to apply it back out and fix it. Yeah, but right. So that's cool, and that works for some, but that's not really going to get us forward because you don't know what's changed. You don't have the visibility of what's going on in there. You don't know if you're doing something in best practices. So there's some pretty good reasons for doing what we're doing here. And then, another talk I did recently, I've been doing too many talks, but talking about hybrid cloud. Very seldom nowadays is a large organization going to be using purely any of these icons on the screen. There's some mixture going on. As I mentioned, when you were talking about Salesforce before, I went out and Googled really quickly on the old browser, and there's a Terraform module for Salesforce on their IAM side. So how do you actually how do you ensure that policies you set up in IAM on Salesforce are what you want them to be? And that's what's sort of interesting about this space is there's so much of this code which has been contributed in an open source manner that no matter what you're looking at, there's a way to improve what you're doing, and we're here to sort of help ensure that the security of that is done correctly.
I can't believe we've got 5 minutes left, John. This has been a great conversation. I mean, I personally have more questions about this just because I'm super curious about, there's the ability to identify, detect, respond, and recover. I mean, you're doing things like a risk mitigation here as well. I see cloud infrastructure oftentimes as like a hotel, right? The hotel front door is secure, but it's your responsibility to lock the door to your hotel room, right? And a lot of times people forget about that. And a lot of times we just forget to deadbolt it, right? And this kind of architecture, the identify, detect, respond, and recover is the tools that very simplistically say, hey, you should put a deadbolt on your door because otherwise someone's going to walk in there. We've got about 5 minutes here, John. Oh, no, did you want to add something?
Oh, no, you're going straight on. It's just on that one really briefly.
Sure.
So you're talking about the concept of shared responsibility, right? Is the buzzword which came up about 2 years ago. And honestly, I didn't like that buzzword at first. And I think for me, the journey over the last few years has been really interesting in going from, I'm lucky, right? I have a background in infrastructure, security operations, overall infrastructure operations, software development, doing a startup type of thing. So I'm able to look at these from different angles. But I sort of consider myself a security guy. And really over the last, especially 6 months, but 12 months, I've really drank the Kool-Aid on this developer-first concept. You hear me talking about CNCF and some of these type of things, but that's sort of part of what's going on back to this concept of shared responsibility. Mm-hmm. While the cloud providers, their security tools have gotten amazingly better since a previous life when I actually tried to do a startup that was going to compete against Amazon and say that I was more secure. We all make mistakes. Those tools have gotten better. I actually did that. It's still actually, there's a combination of I can't have that provider do everything security-wise because there's something which is going to be very custom to my application. So I'm going to have to be writing some of this ISC or doing this in some manner. So there's always going to be that requirement that it has to be secure.
I think this is a brilliant conversation. Again, I wish we had more time to go over this. I'm getting a question here really quick. What does fix risks stand for in this diagram? Can you touch on that really quick before we go on?
Yeah, definitely. And this comes back to, I did sort of blow over what we talk about when we talk about policy as code. So off the top of my head, since we're talking about Amazon, and say security groups, and I gave an example around SSH, and maybe you put a security group on there that says everyone in the world can talk to port 22, so 0.0.0.0/0 has access to port 22, and you apply that to the server. That would be considered a violation of one of our policies. I'm not going to remember the name of it, but you can probably guess it has something to do with SSH world access. So once we know that, and we see that that's a violation of a policy, which makes sense in most organizations, let's go ahead and fix that, right? And to fix against that, what will happen is we're able to actually go through the code, figure out what your IP block is or what it probably is that you're using, at least on the inside, on your VPC, and we'll make that pull request on that particular bit of code for that security group to use the more limited IP block. And it's a pull request, right? We're not automatically going and modifying the code. This is a recommendation. So if you have the experience saying, hey, actually, I need 2 IP blocks or it needs to be a public IP block, you can still modify that pull request before it's been merged, then approve it and merge it. So that's the type of stuff we do.
Very cool. All right, John, we have time for like a couple of quick fire questions. And by the way, if you put in a question here in the chat window and we don't get to it, that's okay. We're gonna let John here answer those offline. Really quick, John. There's one question I had a slide up earlier. Do I really need infrastructure as a code and RPA? Do I need both of them?
This is an interesting one. I was thinking about this when I saw that too. RPA, at least on my radar, not about you, Bill, but on my radar, RPA came into mind really over the last year. It's one of those things which has existed for a lot longer, but has a sort of a different name, and someone figured out how to give it initials, I think, or an acronym, whatever you call that. But I think they sort of occupy two different parts of an enterprise. So in RPA, at least in my mind, the way I think of it is going to be more focused on the business side of things. And as I believe you mentioned, tying into inventory systems and things like that. So maybe you have something set up in Salesforce or in SAP that says, hey, at max, we're going to use X dollars on Amazon on a month. So you're going to have some level of control over that. That's what RPA would be taking care of. And then what do you do with that? How do you configure and run that is the ISC side. So I think a lot more companies are engaged in ISC than they are in RPA. But that percentage, I think, is also changing pretty quickly.
No, I think that's super interesting, and I guess obviously a lot of stuff is around use case. One last question, and then unfortunately we got to wrap it up. For everyone listening, I know we're having fun. For everyone listening, in terms of just being able to adopt this kind of stuff, what should teams be looking for or preparing for to adopt infrastructure as a code concepts?
It really at the core, I think, around something like this is picking that language ahead of time. So whatever that ISC language is you're using, does it have the flexibility to support where you guys might want to go in the future? I mentioned the Salesforce example. Is it, then I come back to my sort of open source type things. Is it being patched? Is it being updated? Is it popular? Is it easy? It's going to be easy to both educate your team on it as well as find developers and engineers who have experience in that area. And then is it secureable? Is there support for it in any security tool out there? Is it something that's brand new and cutting edge and it might take a year or two for enterprise security packages to come up to date on, or maybe a few weeks? So those sort of things to think about, like not just saying, hey, cool technology, but how does that mature into my organization and how can we secure it?
That's perfect. John, again, this hour flew by. I can honestly talk to you about this for a while longer. Thank you for all this great information. And again, I'm hoping that our inboxes and Twitters and LinkedIn feeds are going to be blowing up with new friends and colleagues. So thank you so much. Brian, let me pass it back to you to wrap it up for us.
Great, Bill. And John, thank you so much. My God, what a conversation. And just a couple of very quick things. We are going to be sending you an email by tomorrow that will have a link to the archive of this conversation. There was so much great stuff that was talked about here. I know you're going to want to share it with others. And some of the nuances and ideas that were shared here, so much to help us. And to Bill's point about connecting with these guys, look them up. Bill Clayman from Switch, John Kinsella from Accurix. They're going to have a lot of good information for you if you follow them, and they love to talk to you. So please definitely do that. So I want to thank everybody for joining us. Again, you'll get a link to the presentation within 24 hours. But for now, on behalf of Information Week, I'm Brian Gillooly. Thanks for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.